Welcome back to Dynamic Interactions. Today, we are talking about the Cuba Missile Crisis. Before we crash right into it, please consider like this video and subscribing. It helps our channel grow. Also, leave a comment with where you are watching from. I find it fascinating to see where you all are from. Now, let's dive into today's video. While the crisis is known as the 13 days, the timeline of events was much longer and more complex, is a crucial insight into the true nature of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The widely recognized 13-day period from October 16th to October 28th, 1962, captures the most intense and public moments of the confrontation, but it is merely the climax of a much longer series of events. The origins of the crisis can be traced back to the early days of the Cold War and the U.S. and Soviet Union's mutual distrust and strategic maneuvering. For the Soviet Union, the deployment of missiles in Cuba was a response to several perceived threats and imbalances. The U.S. had already placed its Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Turkey and Italy, on the doorstep of the Soviet Union. This gave the U.S. a significant first-strike advantage. By placing its own missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union sought to restore a sense of nuclear parity and deter a potential U.S. invasion of Cuba, which was a real concern for Fidel Castro's government after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The Soviet plan to secretly deploy these missiles, codenamed Operation Anadir, began in August 1962, involving the clandestine transport of personnel, equipment, and ballistic missiles to Cuba. The 13 days began not with a sudden discovery, but with a routine intelligence mission. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and took photographs that revealed the construction of launch sites for Soviet SS-4 and SS-5 medium-range ballistic missiles. The subsequent 2 days were a period of frantic and secret internal deliberation within the Kennedy administration. President John F. Kennedy was informed on October 16th, and he immediately convened a group of his top advisors, the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, to discuss a response. The options ranged from a full-scale invasion of Cuba to a naval blockade. The public was kept in the dark during these tense discussions. The crisis became public on October 22nd, when Kennedy addressed the nation and announced the discovery of the missiles and the imposition of a naval quarantine of Cuba to prevent further Soviet military shipments. For the next 6 days, the world held its breath as the two nuclear superpowers stood on the brink of war. The tension peaked on October 27th, known as Black Saturday, when a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba and a Soviet submarine was nearly forced to the surface by U.S. destroyers, an incident that was not fully understood until decades later to have almost led to a nuclear exchange. The public resolution came on October 28th, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced over Radio Moscow that the missile sites would be dismantled. This was a result of intense back-channel negotiations. The public deal was that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. public pledge not to invade the island. However, the full resolution was more complex. A secret agreement was also made. The U.S. would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The existence of this secret agreement was not revealed to the public until 1987. Even after October 28th, the crisis was far from over. The agreement to remove the missiles was a starting point, not a conclusion. Negotiations continued for weeks to finalize the details of the withdrawal and to verify compliance. The U.S. still needed to confirm that all missiles and nuclear warheads were removed, and the Soviets were wary of the U.S. commitment to its non-invasion pledge. The final removal of all Soviet nuclear warheads from Cuba was not completed until December 1, 1962, nearly 2 months after the 13 days began. The deployment of Jupiter missiles in Turkey was a pivotal, yet often overlooked, factor in the escalation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. While they may have been a point of pride for NATO, they were strategically a liability. The strategic context of the Jupiter missiles. The U.S. had deployed 15 PGM-19 Jupiter Intermediate-Range Ballistic Missiles, or IRBMs, to Turkey in 1961 as part of a NATO agreement. These missiles were liquid-fueled, which made them slow to launch and highly vulnerable to a first strike. They were essentially sitting ducks, making their military value questionable. The Soviets knew this, and the U.S. knew the Soviets knew this. This technological obsolescence was a major reason why President Kennedy was already looking for an excuse to have them removed. However, their political value, as a symbol of American commitment to NATO and a direct threat to the Soviet Union's security, was immense. The missiles were deployed in a fixed above-ground position in Turkey, a country bordering the Soviet Union, and were capable of reaching Moscow in just a few minutes. From the Soviet perspective, the Jupiter missiles were a direct provocation and a major imbalance of power. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev viewed the deployment as a clear strategic encirclement by the U.S. and its allies. He saw the placement of Soviet missiles in Cuba not as an act of aggression, but as a necessary and reciprocal measure to balance the nuclear threat. The Soviet Union justified its actions by arguing that the U.S. had no right to object to missiles in Cuba when it had its own missiles so close to the Soviet border. This argument was a key talking point in Soviet propaganda and diplomatic exchanges during the crisis. During the 13 days of the crisis, the Jupiter missiles became a critical, though publicly unacknowledged, element of the resolution. While Kennedy initially hesitated to link the two missile deployments, a secret deal proposed by his brother, Robert Kennedy, became the key to de-escalation. The public agreement was that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. public pledge not to invade the island. However, the crucial secret component was the U.S. promise to dismantle and remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This gave Khrushchev a way to back down without appearing to have capitulated completely. The U.S. could also remove its obsolete missiles from Turkey without appearing to have caved to Soviet pressure, as the removal could be presented as a routine operational decision. The secrecy surrounding the deal was essential for both sides to save face and avoid political embarrassment. The public wouldn't learn of the secret missile removal until decades later. The discovery of the Soviet missiles in Cuba was a critical moment in history, and it was made possible by the intersection of advanced aerial reconnaissance technology and the meticulous work of skilled photoanalysts. The U-2 spy plane and the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, were the central players in this intelligence coup. The U-2 mission and its high-tech cargo. Major Richard Heiser's flight on October 14, 1962, was no ordinary mission. He was flying a Lockheed U-2, a remarkable aircraft designed for high-altitude, long-endurance reconnaissance. The U-2 flew at an altitude of over 70,000 feet, an edge-of-space flight profile that was believed to be out of the range of Soviet air defenses at the time. The plane was equipped with the Hi-Con B camera, a state-of-the-art panoramic camera that could capture incredibly detailed images from such a high altitude. It was so precise that it could identify objects as small as 2.5 feet from a height of 60,000 feet. Heiser's mission was to fly over a specific part of Cuba where intelligence reports had indicated suspicious activity. He was in Cuban airspace for less than 7 minutes, but captured 928 high-resolution photographs. The eyes of the CIA. The success of the mission depended not just on the photos, but on their interpretation. The film was immediately flown under armed guard to the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, in Washington, D.C., a secretive facility established by the CIA. It was here that a team of expert analysts, led by Arthur Lundahl, meticulously reviewed the film. These analysts, including figures like Dino Brugioni, were part of a new breed of intelligence professionals who could read the ground from above. They were trained to spot subtle patterns and anomalies that would be invisible to the untrained eye. For them, a newly paved road leading into a cleared field, or the distinctive canvas coverings on a trailer were like a signature. The moment of discovery. As the analysts worked on the film, they began to recognize specific signatures of Soviet military installations. They spotted launch pads, distinctive star-shaped patterns in the earth that were characteristic of Soviet surface-to-air missile sites. Transporter erectors, long covered trucks that were used to transport and set up the missiles. The shape and size of these vehicles were known from previous intelligence on Soviet weaponry. Support equipment, the presence of large tents, barracks, and even the tracks of heavy vehicles in the dirt confirmed that a large-scale construction project was underway. The most damning evidence was the identification of SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles. The analysts could determine the exact length and features of these weapons by measuring their shadows in the photos. This was the undeniable smoking gun that confirmed the presence of offensive nuclear weapons. The photo interpretation was not a slam dunk, as some of the objects were cleverly camouflaged, but the analysts' expertise allowed them to piece together the full picture of the Soviet deployment. This discovery on October 15th and the subsequent briefings of President Kennedy were the spark that ignited the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a testament to the fact that in the world of espionage, a single photograph can change the course of history. The contribution of Oleg Penkovsky to the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis cannot be overstated. His intelligence wasn't just a single smoking gun, but rather a continuous stream of information that fundamentally reshaped how the United States understood and reacted to the Soviet threat. An unprecedented human source. Oleg Penkovsky was a colonel in the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. For over a year, he had been a top-level mole, providing the West with an incredible amount of classified material. His access was extraordinary. He was a close confidant of the head of the GRU and was involved in high-level military and scientific committees. Through his British contact, businessman Greville Wynne, Penkovsky passed on thousands of pages of documents, including classified blueprints, technical manuals, and personal notes. He used a miniature camera to photograph documents and even smuggled out rolls of film in boxes of candy. The intelligence that de-escalated the crisis. The most crucial information Penkovsky provided was not about the presence of missiles in Cuba, though he did pass on plans and descriptions that helped with a definitive identification of the sites, but about the overall state of the Soviet military. His intelligence revealed that the Soviet Union was not as militarily powerful as it claimed. Khrushchev's public boasts about the Soviet nuclear arsenal were largely a bluff. Penkovsky's data showed that the Soviet Union's intercontinental ballistic missile program, ICBM, was far behind the U.S., and that their nuclear arsenal was much smaller than the CIA had estimated. This was a critical piece of information for President Kennedy. The Soviet missiles in Cuba were a serious, but not an existential threat. Penkovsky provided technical manuals for the SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles, including information on their size, required support equipment, and launch procedures. This allowed the U.S. photo analysts to quickly and confidently identify the sites from the U-2 photos. Without this intelligence, the U.S. would have been operating on a much more uncertain basis, making it more difficult to distinguish real threats from decoys or to accurately assess the readiness of the missiles. This intelligence had a profound impact on Kennedy's decision-making. Knowing that the Soviets were not ready for an all-out nuclear war and that their missile program was in its infancy, gave him the confidence to pursue a naval quarantine and a diplomatic solution, rather than a potentially disastrous invasion or airstrike. It allowed the U.S. to call Khrushchev's bluff without triggering a wider conflict. The price of truth. Penkovsky's espionage came at a steep price. He was arrested by the KGB on October 22, 1962, the very day that President Kennedy announced the discovery of the missiles to the American public. This suggests that the Soviets may have realized a leak had occurred. Penkovsky was put on a public show trial for treason in May 1963. He was convicted and, according to official Soviet sources, executed by a firing squad shortly after, on May 16, 1963. While the exact details of his fate have been the subject of some speculation and controversy, his immense sacrifice for what he believed was a necessary step to prevent a nuclear war remains a cornerstone of the Cuban Missile Crisis narrative. His actions provided the United States with the intelligence and psychological edge needed to navigate the crisis and ultimately save the world from a catastrophic conflict. The downing of Major Rudolph Anderson Jr.'s U-2 on October 27, 1962, was arguably the most dangerous moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It marked a terrifying escalation from a high-stakes standoff to a shooting conflict, but Kennedy's restraint in the face of immense pressure prevented a potential nuclear war. October 27th is known as Black Saturday because of a series of events that brought the world to the brink. On that day, in addition to the U-2 shootdown, a U.S. Navy destroyer dropped practice depth charges on a Soviet submarine, which, unbeknownst to the Americans, was carrying a nuclear-armed torpedo. The submarine captain nearly launched it in response. Simultaneously, another U.S. reconnaissance plane accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace near Siberia, causing a panic. But the death of Major Rudolph Anderson Jr. was the most shocking and immediate crisis. Anderson's U-2 was shot down over the eastern part of Cuba by an SA-2 Guideline Surface-to-Air Missile, SAM. While the Soviet chain of command was highly centralized, the local Soviet commanders in Cuba, believing a U.S. invasion was imminent, ordered the launch without Moscow's approval. The missile's proximity-fused warhead likely exploded near the U-2, causing a decompression of Anderson's pressure suit and killing him almost instantly. The news of the shootdown created an immediate and furious response from Kennedy's military advisors. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had already been pushing for an airstrike and invasion, and Anderson's death was seen as the justification they needed. They urged Kennedy to retaliate immediately, arguing that any delay would be perceived as weakness and invite further Soviet aggression. The consensus among the military was to launch an immediate and overwhelming strike. However, President Kennedy, with his brother Robert Kennedy's support, maintained a cool head. He recognized that a military response would likely trigger an irreversible chain of events. A retaliatory airstrike would almost certainly have destroyed Soviet missile sites and killed Soviet personnel, forcing Khrushchev to respond. This would have led to a full-scale invasion, potentially involving tactical nuclear weapons, which the Soviets had in Cuba. Kennedy and his inner circle understood that the crisis had to be resolved through diplomacy, not force. The downing of the U-2 became a pivotal, albeit tragic, moment. It underscored the fact that control was slipping away from both leaders, and that a single mistake or unauthorized action could lead to a nuclear exchange. This realization spurred Kennedy to intensify his diplomatic efforts, leading to the secret deal with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin later that night. The deal included the public removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade, and a secret agreement to remove the U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Major Anderson's death was the sole combat casualty of the crisis. He was posthumously awarded the Air Force Cross, the highest U.S. military award for valor after the Medal of Honor, for his extraordinary heroism and for providing the intelligence that was crucial in charting the nation's course during the crisis. His sacrifice and Kennedy's wise decision not to retaliate ultimately helped de-escalate the crisis and avert a global catastrophe. The declaration of DEFCON 2 by the U.S. military on October 24, 1962, was an unprecedented escalation that took the world to the brink of nuclear war. This wasn't a general alert for all armed forces. It was a specific order for the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, the branch responsible for the U.S. nuclear arsenal. This heightened readiness was meant to send a clear, unmistakable. The DEFCON, Defense Readiness Condition System, has 5 levels, with DEFCON 5 being the lowest state of readiness and DEFCON 1 being the highest state of readiness. On October 22, President Kennedy put all U.S. military forces worldwide on DEFCON 3, an increase in force readiness above normal. However, 2 days later, he specifically authorized SAC to move to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 2, codenamed Fast Pace, meant that the armed forces were ready to deploy and engage in combat within a matter of hours. For SAC, this was the last step before nuclear war. It was a direct signal that the U.S. was ready to launch a nuclear strike in response to a Soviet first strike or any other act of aggression. The declaration of DEFCON 2 initiated a series of dramatic and chilling preparations. Airborne alert. The number of B-52 bombers carrying nuclear bombs on continuous airborne alert was dramatically increased. Under Operation Chrome Dome, a significant portion of SAC's bomber fleet was in the air at all times, flying routes near the Soviet borders. This ensured that a retaliatory strike could be launched even if U.S. airfields were destroyed in a surprise attack. Dispersal of forces. Nuclear-capable bomber squadrons were dispersed from their main bases to civilian and smaller military airfields across the country to make them less vulnerable to a preemptive strike. This was a critical part of the U.S. strategy to guarantee a second strike capability. Missile readiness. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, were also put on high alert. Missile crews lived on site in underground bunkers with war plans in hand, ready to launch their payloads with a moment's notice. Submarine deployment. The Navy's Polaris submarines, armed with nuclear missiles, were moved to their designated launch positions, providing an almost undetectable nuclear deterrent. The declaration of DEFCON 2 was a chilling demonstration of the U.S. commitment to its nuclear strategy of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It was a bluff and a warning, but one that both sides knew could turn into a horrifying reality with a single misstep. The world had never been closer to a full-scale nuclear exchange, and the declaration of DEFCON 2 was the stark, tangible evidence of that terrifying proximity. The naval quarantine was more than just a legal distinction. It was a psychological and diplomatic masterstroke that gave the U.S. the initiative and forced the Soviet Union to make the next move. It was a strategy of controlled pressure that avoided a sudden, irreversible escalation. The psychological warfare of the quarantine. The quarantine's success lay in its ability to create a clear, visible boundary without firing a shot. By announcing the quarantine publicly and detailing its terms, President Kennedy put the onus on the Soviet Union to decide whether to comply or confront. The Soviet ships were essentially given a choice: either turn back or risk a search that would reveal their cargo. This put the Soviets in a difficult position. If they tried to force their way through, they would be seen as the aggressors, and if they turned back, it would be a public admission of defeat. The quarantine line itself was a powerful symbol. It was a tangible, physical manifestation of U.S. resolve. It showed the world that the U.S. was not going to invade Cuba without warning, but would not tolerate the presence of offensive missiles. This gave the U.S. the moral high ground and put the Soviets on the defensive. The global reaction and diplomatic impact. The quarantine was not without its critics. Some U.S. military leaders wanted a more aggressive response, such as a full-scale invasion or an airstrike. Other nations and world leaders also expressed concern that the quarantine was an act of aggression. However, Kennedy's diplomatic efforts, including his televised address to the nation and a letter to Khrushchev, helped to garner international support. The quarantine was ultimately supported by the Organization of American States, the OAS, which gave it a veneer of multilateral legitimacy. The quarantine also served as a valuable tool for back-channel negotiations. By creating a physical boundary and a public crisis, it forced a quick resolution. The 7 days between the announcement of the quarantine and the Soviet ships turning back were filled with intense, behind-the-scenes negotiations. The quarantine provided a tangible problem that both sides could work to solve, and it provided a clear measure of success when the Soviet ships finally turned around. It was a low-risk, high-reward strategy that paid off brilliantly, demonstrating that in the Cold War, a show of force could be as effective as force itself. Vasily Arkhipov's actions on October 27, 1962, were a crucial moment of individual heroism and discipline that directly prevented a potential nuclear conflict. His decision was not only an act of remarkable restraint, but also a testament to the precariousness of command and control during the crisis. On October 27th, the Soviet submarine B-59 was one of 4 Foxtrot-class submarines deployed to the waters around Cuba. They were out of contact with Moscow and were being hunted by a U.S. naval task force. The U.S. Navy, unaware that the submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes, began dropping non-lethal, low-powered depth charges. The purpose was to force the submarines to surface so they could be identified and escorted away from the quarantine zone. To the crew of the B-59, the depth charges felt like a real attack. They were running low on battery power, suffering from intense heat and carbon dioxide buildup, and believed they were under a direct assault by U.S. forces. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, convinced that the war had already begun, ordered the preparation of the submarine's single nuclear torpedo. The torpedo was a special weapon, meaning it was equipped with a 15-kiloton nuclear warhead. The submarine F-59's nuclear torpedo launch protocol required the unanimous consent of 3 senior officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov. While the captain and the political officer were in favor of a launch, Arkhipov refused. He insisted that the submarine must surface and receive a direct order from Moscow. Arkhipov's refusal was a radical act of defiance against his superior officer in a time of intense stress and perceived mortal danger. His reasoning was clear. Without a confirmed order, firing the nuclear torpedo would be an irreversible step. He argued that the non-lethal nature of the depth charges suggested the U.S. was trying to communicate rather than destroy the submarine. After a heated argument, Arkhipov convinced Captain Savitsky to surface the submarine. The F-59 eventually broke radio silence and was contacted by U.S. forces, and the crisis at sea was averted. The fact that a single man's decision, under extreme duress, prevented a nuclear strike was a powerful revelation that only came to light decades later at a 2002 conference, when declassified records and the testimony of participants confirmed the near miss. Archipov's actions demonstrated the fragility of command during the crisis and highlighted the thin line between diplomacy and nuclear annihilation. Vasily Arkhipov's actions and the broader situation of the Soviet submarines highlight the extreme tension and the ever-present risk of human error during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The fact that the U.S. and Soviet militaries were operating under entirely different assumptions about the nature of the engagement at sea created a highly volatile situation. The Special Weapon Protocol and its flaws. The Soviet submarine flotilla sent to Cuba, unbeknownst to the U.S., was a secret mission with a chilling objective: to provide a retaliatory strike capability from the sea. Each of the 4 submarines was armed with one nuclear-tipped torpedo, a special weapon. The launch protocol required the unanimous consent of the captain and the political officer. However, because Arkhipov was the commander of the entire flotilla, his consent was also required on his boat, the B-59. This extra layer of command, a unique circumstance not found on the other submarines, was the only thing that prevented the launch. This protocol was a deliberate design to prevent an unauthorized launch, but the B-59's near miss demonstrated just how close a misinterpretation of events could come to bypassing this safeguard. The other submarines did not have this fail-safe of an extra commander, making them just as, if not more, dangerous. The aftermath and legacy. The B-59 eventually surfaced and was escorted out of the quarantine zone. The U.S. Navy and the American public were completely unaware of the near disaster that had occurred. The full story of the submarine's mission and the close call only became public in 2002 at a conference in Havana, attended by American, Cuban, and Russian officials. During the conference, retired Soviet officers revealed the presence of nuclear weapons on the submarines and the details of the B-59 incident. This revelation was a moment of profound realization for the American attendees, who had believed that their actions were a controlled, measured show of force. The incident is a chilling case study in the dangers of the Cold War and the unpredictability of human behavior under pressure. It's a powerful reminder that even with the best plans and fail-safes, a single individual's decision can be the deciding factor between peace and global catastrophe. Arkhipov's heroism has since been recognized internationally as a pivotal, albeit unknown, moment in history. He has been hailed as the man who saved the world by historians and political analysts. His actions stand as a testament to the importance of restraint and reason in the face of what appears to be an all-out crisis. The back-channel negotiations between Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin were the decisive factor in ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. While public communication was strained and formal, this secret meeting provided the flexibility and trust needed to find a solution. The role of back-channel diplomacy. By October 27th, Black Saturday, the public and official communications between Washington and Moscow were at a deadlock. A formal letter from Khrushchev to Kennedy was filled with complex, seemingly contradictory demands, including a public pledge not to invade Cuba and the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The U.S. ex-com rejected the letter, believing it was a sign of a divided Soviet leadership. With military options gaining traction, the need for a private, direct line of communication became urgent. The meeting between Robert Kennedy and Dobrynin, a relationship cultivated in the preceding months, was that lifeline. The secret deal. The meeting, held at the Soviet embassy, was a tense, high-stakes affair. Robert Kennedy, speaking on behalf of his brother, delivered a two-part message. The ultimatum. He first reiterated the public demand that the Soviet Union remove its offensive missiles from Cuba. He made it clear that if the U.S. did not receive a commitment to remove the missiles by the next day, it would begin military action with an airstrike and a full invasion. The deadline was a powerful, non-negotiable term that forced Khrushchev's hand. The secret offer. Immediately following the ultimatum, Kennedy presented the secret deal regarding the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. He assured Dobrynin that while this could not be part of the public agreement, the U.S. would, on its own timeline, remove its missiles from Turkey. He framed it as a deal that had already been in the works and the matter of strategic convenience, not a direct concession to Soviet demands. This allowed Khrushchev to claim a major diplomatic victory at home without publicly embarrassing the U.S. The secret nature of the deal was critical for both leaders. President Kennedy could not be seen as trading away NATO assets under duress, as it would have alienated U.S. allies and made him appear weak. For Khrushchev, it provided a face-saving way to back down from the crisis without appearing to have capitulated to U.S. threats. Dobrynin immediately relayed the information back to Moscow, and within hours, Khrushchev agreed to the deal. The meeting was a testament to the power of personal diplomacy in avoiding a global catastrophe. It allowed two leaders who were constrained by public posturing and bureaucratic inertia to find a private solution. While the world celebrated the end of the crisis, the true resolution remained a closely guarded secret for decades. It was a secret deal that not only averted nuclear war, but also fundamentally shaped the future of Cold War diplomacy. President Kennedy's preparation for a full-scale invasion of Cuba, including the drafting of a public address, shows the chilling reality that his administration was prepared to go to war to resolve the crisis. The existence of the speech and its grim content reveals just how close the world came to a potentially catastrophic conflict. The Invasion of Cuba speech. The speech, drafted by Kennedy's speechwriter Theodore Sorensen, was a chilling, direct address to the American people. It was a formal, somber message designed to inform the public of the U.S. military action and rally support for the war. The key points of the draft speech were: justification for invasion. The speech would have explained that the invasion was a necessary response to the clandestine introduction of offensive weapons into the Western Hemisphere. It would have presented the action as a last resort after diplomatic efforts failed. Acknowledging the risks, the speech would not have shied away from the potential for a larger conflict. It would have warned that the invasion was a grave step and that the American people should be prepared for potential casualties and a protracted conflict. The language used was stark and without the usual political euphemisms, highlighting the high stakes. The call to action. The speech would have called on the American people to support the military action, emphasizing that the U.S. was defending its security and freedom. It would have framed the invasion as a fight against Soviet aggression and a defense of the democratic way of life. The drafting of the Invasion of Cuba speech was not an act of bravado, but a sober contingency plan. It was a testament to the fact that Kennedy and his advisors were considering a full range of options, including the most extreme. The speech was written and ready to go by October 27th, the day the crisis reached its peak. The fact that Kennedy chose a diplomatic path instead of a military one, even with a ready-to-go speech, is a powerful indicator of his restraint. It shows that he was not only capable of a strong military response, but also willing to exhaust all other options before committing the nation to war. The speech remains a tangible reminder of just how close the world was to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet Union's efforts to conceal their military buildup in Cuba were extensive and systematic, but ultimately proved to be a failure against sophisticated American intelligence gathering. The secrecy of Operation Anadir, the code name for the Soviet deployment, was paramount to its success, but the measures taken to hide the operation were a blend of meticulous planning and hurried improvisation. The elements of deception. The Soviet strategy for concealment was multifaceted, focusing on disguising both personnel and equipment. To hide the thousands of Soviet troops, they were given civilian clothing and told to avoid drawing attention to themselves. They were issued fake Cuban identification cards and told to learn a few basic Spanish phrases. The plan was to make it seem as though they were simply agricultural or technical advisors, not soldiers. This was an attempt to exploit the perception that Cuba was a key ally, receiving economic and technical assistance from the Soviet bloc. The concealment of military equipment was even more complex. Missile transporters, launchers, and support vehicles were meticulously covered with canvas tarps. When not in use, they were hidden in forests or camouflaged with nets and natural foliage. The missile launch sites themselves were designed to be temporary and mobile, a feature intended to make them difficult to detect from the air. In some cases, the Soviets even used inflatable decoy equipment to confuse U.S. reconnaissance. Estudiants. The triumph of U.S. intelligence. Despite the Soviets' best efforts, their deception was not enough to fool American intelligence. The U.S. had several advantages that enabled it to see through the ruse. 1. High-altitude reconnaissance. The most critical tool was the U-2 spy plane. The U-2 flew at altitudes of over 70,000 feet, far above the range of most air defenses at the time. Its advanced cameras could capture incredibly high-resolution panoramic photographs that were a smoking gun of the Soviet buildup. 2. Photo interpretation. The key to a successful intelligence mission is not just collecting data, but also accurately interpreting it. The CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center, or NPIC, was staffed with highly trained experts who could spot subtle signs of military activity. They noticed patterns that an untrained eye would miss: roads being built into remote areas, distinctive Soviet military vehicle tracks in the dirt, the specific dimensions of a construction site, and the shadows cast by long, covered objects that matched the profile of ballistic missiles. 3. Human intelligence. The U-2 imagery was corroborated by crucial human intelligence. Oleg Penkovsky, the high-ranking GRU officer, had been providing detailed information on Soviet missile capabilities and troop movements for over a year. His information on the SS-4 missiles, including their size, launch requirements, and support equipment, allowed American photo analysts to quickly and confidently identify the missile sites. The combination of these intelligence methods made the Soviet concealment efforts a failure. The U-2 photographs of October 14, 1962, provided undeniable evidence of the missile sites, confirming the U.S. government's worst fears. The discovery set in motion the 13 days that followed, demonstrating that in the age of aerial surveillance, even the most meticulous attempts at deception can be rendered moot by superior technology and expert analysis.